boys and girls, and welcome to our last chapter of Flat Stanley. Now, we've been doing a lot of reading over these past few weeks to read our Flat Stanley story, and today we're on our very last chapter. So let's say our thank yous to all of our people so we can get started. So of course we need to say thank you to the author Jeff Brown, the illustrator Scott Nash, the publishers HarperCollins, and Access Copyright on behalf of the publisher for letting us read it. All right, boys and girls, now we are on the last chapter, which is chapter 5, and its title is Arthur's Good Idea. So, Stanley has been the creative one so far. He's had all of his big ideas, always brave. I wonder what Arthur's idea is going to be. I wonder if you guys can make any predictions. Well, let's see. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, over there, that must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the art thieves." And things like that. There's everyone pointing at him as he walks down the street. But after a few weeks of the whispering and the staring, all started to stop. People had other things to think about. Stanley didn't mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as Stanley passed by. "Hey, super skinny," they would shout, and even meaner things, and they would look as he walked by. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I most mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. I'm flat." "Shame on them," Mrs. Lambchop said. "It is wrong to dislike someone because of their shape, or their skin, or what makes them different." "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everyone to like everyone." "Perhaps," Mrs. Lambchop said, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt beside Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled the day you were a kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley," he said, "please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like other people. But I have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. "I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make things worse." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the darkness. There they are. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little bit better than he had before. And then suddenly, though he was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where toys and other things were kept. He began to rummage through the box. Stanley sat up on the bed to watch. Arthur flung aside the football and some soldiers and airplane models and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, "Aha!" each other. So, boys and girls, Arthur has an idea with a bicycle pump. What is your prediction? What do you think he's going to do to help Stanley? Let's see. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and clamped his lips tightly around it so no air could escape. I'll go slowly, Arthur said. If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand at me. He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except for Stanley's cheeks got bigger. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle sign, so he pumped again. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, Arthur shouted, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside. He got bigger and bigger and bigger. The buttons off his pajama top burst. Pop, pop, pop. A moment more, and he was all rounded out. Head and body, arms and legs. But not his right foot. The right foot stayed flat. There he is, getting all round again. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a little shake would help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and then with a little whoosh sound, it swelled out to match the left. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop walked by the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. We heard you boys, Mr. Lambchop said. Up and talking when you should be asleep? Shame on... George! Said Mrs. Lambchop. Stanley's round again. You're right, said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were made to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them. And then they turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long, tiring day. Very soon, all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. So, boys and girls, that is the end of our Flat Stanley book. I have some questions to ask you about this chapter, but I enjoyed Flat Stanley so much, and I hope that you boys and girls did too. The best part of Flat Stanley is there's even more books in his series. So there are big chapter books. There's a few here in the back that you can take a look at. So there's Flat Stanley, Flat Again, Invisible Stanley. He has a lot of other adventures, even Stanley in Space. So if you really liked this book, you can do some more reading at home with your own families. You can look into some of the Flat Stanley books. So I hope this inspires you to do a little bit more reading and see some more Stanley stories. But for now, I have some questions for you for our chapter 5, our last chapter. So my first question for you is, how did people start treating Stanley because he was different? So this happened at the beginning of our chapter. How were they treating Stanley? Question number 2 is, how did it make Stanley feel? And the last was, number 3, how did Arthur solve this problem? Arthur was the clever one this time and had a solution to the problem. So boys and girls, as usual, all those questions are in a Google form that's attached to this assignment. Since it's a writing activity, you can type your answers into the Google form, or you can write it out by hand, take a picture of it, and put it into our Dropbox. Either way, whichever way it works for you. All right, boys and girls, good luck and have fun.